Welcome. In this video, we're going to be analyzing verse 34 of Daniel chapter 11. And for this entire video, we're going to be focusing on just one question, and that is, does the little help of Daniel 11:34 refer to the Maccabees? Now, this is a very ancient idea, and we find it in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome in 200 AD, and also in the writings of Porphyry in 250 AD. Before we can answer the question, we need to take a step back and consider the history for a moment. So remember that the Maccabees rise up and fight against the Jewish persecution committed by Antiochus. But in the face of this persecution, there's also another Jewish group that arises, and this group is known as the Wise, in Hebrew Maskalim, and it is to this group that the author of Daniel belongs. And these groups are the polar opposites of each other. The Maccabees believe that violent resistance is necessary to defeat the Seleucids, while the Wise believe in only passive resistance. The Maccabees believe they will only free themselves through human intervention, while the Wise believe they must patiently await for divine intervention. And all of this information is found in verse 33 and 34 of Daniel 11, which reads, quote, "The wise among the people shall give understanding to many for some days. However, they shall fall by the sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely," end quote. So the contention is that when the verse says when they fall victim, they being the wise, that they shall receive a little help, and this little help is referring to the Maccabees. So many interpreters believe that this verse is showing that Daniel is appreciative of the Maccabean resistance to the Seleucid persecution. But is this the correct interpretation of the text? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to take a step back and consider our historical timeline. So in 167 BC, we have the abomination of desolation. This is when Antiochus sacrifices a pig in the temple, and thus the temple becomes impure. And it's in response to the abomination of desolation that we have the Maccabean revolt begin. And the Maccabees will fight against the Seleucids, and in 164, the Maccabees actually take back control of the temple and are able to purify it. Now, let's just pause here for a moment and really appreciate this. This small group of Jewish fighters was able to successfully fight back against the power of the Seleucid Empire. It is truly remarkable that the Maccabees were able to defeat this global superpower. So then the obvious question arises, how can Daniel call this significant victory of the Maccabees only, quote, a little help? This is the opposite of little. This is a huge help. How on earth can Daniel refer to the Maccabees as only a little help? Well, to help answer that question, let's consider when the book of Daniel was most likely written. Most scholars are going to say that Daniel wrote between the abomination of desolation in 167 and the purification of the temple in 164. Therefore, Daniel wrote in this 3-year interval. Now, I am going to dedicate a later video just to consider the dating of Daniel, but for now, just take my word for it that the majority of scholars date Daniel between 167 and 164. Now, if that's the case, that means that Daniel was writing before the purification of the temple had taken place, and therefore the Maccabees were most likely still in the early stages of their resistance and hadn't had any significant victories yet. Therefore, it makes sense that Daniel refers to them as only a little help. And this is going to be the first of different theories that we're going to consider. So we're going to call this theory the early days of the Maccabean revolt. And it is argued by Borkum in the following quote. "It is true that the book of Daniel refers to the Maccabees only as a little help for the martyred Hasidim, but this need not be as disparaging a reference as often thought. More probably, it indicates that Daniel was written when the Maccabean resistance had only just begun." End quote. Let's now consider our next theory, which I'm going to call the wise did not advocate violence. So in other words, the reason why Daniel views the Maccabees as only a little help is because Daniel did not approve of their violent techniques. This is nicely summarized in the following passage by Wessels, who writes the following quote, "It is clear from the book of Daniel that the author did not at all support the violent resistance advocated and practiced by the Maccabees. That kind of violence did not find any support in the book of Daniel. The author is pessimistic about such military resistance, and that resistance is seen only as a little help, Daniel 11:34. Writing in the same vein, we read the following from Murphy, quote, "The reference to a little help in Daniel 11:34 may mean the Maccabees. The phrase is a bit insulting. Nowhere in Daniel are Jews urged to fight the Seleucids. Daniel wants them to remain faithful to Torah and to wait until God defeats Antiochus. Militant resistance to Seleucid rule and to Antiochus's persecution is of little use, for matters are ultimately decided on another level. Okay, having now surveyed these two theories, it's now time to consider the most convincing theory. And that is that when Daniel refers to the little help, he's not referring to the Maccabees at all. Newsom, in her commentary, writes the following, quote, "Many commentators understand the expression little help in verse 34 as an allusion to the efforts of Matthias and Judah. However, the immediate context does not favor this interpretation. The emphasis of this verse is on the misfortunes of the Mascalim. More likely, the phrase little help is a comment on the inability of this group to develop a stable following. This is suggested by the following complaint that many who join them act deceitfully or insincerely." End quote. So what Newsom is saying here is that if we read verses 33 and 34 properly, it becomes apparent that the little help in its immediate context is most likely not referring to the Maccabees. So let's read verses 33 and 34 slowly, and I'll be highlighting some key terms. Quote, "The wise among the people shall give understanding to many for some days. However, they shall fall by the sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely." End quote. Okay, so what I've done here is I've highlighted in blue the words they and them. And that's because in the context of this verse, these words are referring back to the wise. So let's replace these theys and thems with the wise. Let's now read the verse again. "When the wise fall victim, the wise shall receive a little help, and many shall join the wise insincerely." End quote. So hopefully now it's a bit clearer that the little help is referring to the people that join the wise insincerely. It is not referring to the Maccabees. Rather, it's referring to these unfaithful followers of the wise. Okay, this may seem a little bit confusing, so let's just summarize everything I've just said. So the wise fall victim to the persecution of Antiochus. But despite this persecution, many people actually come to join the wise and become their followers. But these followers prove to be of little help, because when this persecution starts to impact them directly, they leave the movement, proving that they only joined insincerely. I think a really helpful way to understand what's happening here is actually to use the disciples of Jesus as a bit of an example of what's happening. So the disciples, before Jesus is arrested, are very committed to him. They're constantly saying things to Jesus along the lines of, "We will never leave you, and you can count on us." But then, when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, what happens? Well, the disciples make a quick exit, and in this moment, the disciples could be described as a little help. And I think this is exactly what's happening in Daniel 11:34. The wise, like Jesus, even in the face of persecution, manages to attract a following of people. But when this persecution starts to directly impact these followers themselves, they quickly leave, proving that they had only joined insincerely, and hence they are unfaithful followers of the wise, and are only, therefore, a little help. To finish our discussion of this theory, let's read what Xiao writes in his commentary, quote, "The narrator is bluntly honest about the possible consequences for the faithful." So here Xiao is writing about the wise. "They will suffer for a while at least, their lives may be endangered in various ways, and they may not even survive. They will also have a little help, which probably refers not to any particular group of individuals, but to the general vulnerability of these faithful ones. Their cause would not be advanced by the many who would ally themselves with them insincerely," so the New Revised Standard Version in verse 34. The Hebrew term here being exactly the same as that translated in the New Revised Standard Version as "through intrigue" in verse 21, where it refers to the deceitfulness of Antiochus. The term is also similar to a term used of Antiochus's intrigue in verse 32. The Hebrew word, as mentioned earlier, means something like smooth things. At issue here, it seems, are those who flatter the would-be martyrs with smooth talk and purport to be on their side, but who do little else to indicate their commitments. These people talk a good talk, but give in when the chips are down. End quote. So let's now return to our original question. Does the little help of Daniel 11:34 refer to the Maccabees? Well, I think we can decisively say no, it does not. The little help of Daniel 11:34 is not referring to the Maccabees. Rather, it's referring to these unfaithful followers of the wise. And that is where we will conclude this video. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, leave me a comment, and make sure you are subscribed. If you've watched all the way to the end, thank you so much. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.